it is an honor and a pleasure to have all of you, a lot of beautiful and faces that I see, and friends from all over the world. I see people from the States, from Asia, from Europe, and from Africa. This is very encouraging. So thank you for joining us today. Just a little bit of background. Faith for Earth and UNEP, in partnership with a number of organizations, have been coordinating our participation, or the faith participation, at COP28. So we have launched a program that extends from, started actually a couple of months ago until we get to COP28. And then we are planning to have a faith pavilion at COP28. The good news that we heard yesterday or the day before, that UAE has accepted giving us the pavilion. So we will be organizing our contribution and our engagement at the pavilion for 2 weeks, starting of course late November and until 12th of December. So this is great news, and it gives us the ability to be inclusive and include all religious and spiritual perspectives into the discussions of COP28. So it's a pre-COP, at COP, but also we're working on a post-COP engagement that sustains the engagement of all religious actors in climate change and other environmental issues. So part of the preparatory process is to engage on substantive issues and discuss the priorities and whatever issues that will be discussed by the politicians and the negotiators at COP28. So from now on, we will be having a monthly meeting, inviting 1 or 2 speakers to touch upon such issues. Today, we are very pleased to have Niklas Hagelberg. Niklas is the global climate change coordinator at UNEP. He's responsible for coordinating and policy advising the organization on climate change issues. And he is a pivotal person during the convention meetings, supporting the executive director in her meetings and her interventions, as well as the negotiators on different issues. Today, Niklas will go through some of the priority issues that will be discussed at COP28, and how the UN in general, UNEP and UNFCCC, as well as the presidency of the COP, look at the priorities and what are the issues that we can consider in probably mobilizing actions by faith leaders and their interventions and collaboration with politicians. So we will listen to Niklas for as long as it takes, because this is very important, but probably 20 or 30 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. Niklas, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Iyad, and thank you for inviting me. This is exciting to be here with you. I won't take as long as Iyad mentioned. I hope that I will be done in just a little bit of 10 minutes, and then we can open up for discussions, and I'm happy to answer questions and as I can, and then perhaps talk more about your role and how you as a group can help move the negotiations forward. Let me just find my slides here and share them with you. Iyad, if you could assist me and tell when you see the slides.
We do.
Excellent. All right, so as I said, not too many slides today, and as always, I would hope that we would have more information on what's going to happen at the COP by this time of the year, but don't worry, the subsidiary meetings are coming up under the Climate Convention in the beginning of June this year, and that's usually one of the areas where there's growing clarity on where we are in the negotiations and where we what needs to happen then at the Conference of Parties meeting later in the year. As I don't know how familiar you are with the climate topic, I'm just going to give you a couple of big picture slides first before we go into the priorities for COP28. And the first one, is that moving? There we go. Iyad, did the slide change?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Just sometimes it happens that it changes on one's own laptop, but for the rest of the team, you can't see it. Okay, so based on where we are now in country ambition and the trajectory for implementing climate actions and the policies that are in place, we are still heading towards a 2.8 degree warmer world. And you probably have heard that the last years, they always tend to be the warmest on record. And we're just about to switch into the El Nino cycle. The La Nina is about to end, and there is already signs that El Nino is on our doorstep, which then kind of guides us that there will be even warmer climate in the next few years. So this is a high priority for the Secretary General, and he has repeatedly said that if we do not act now, this is a death sentence, not only for perhaps the societies as we know it, but for many of the peoples out there. A little bit more on where we are. So some of you may be familiar with the emissions gap. That's an annual kind of compilation that UNEP does. It comes out just before the Conference of Parties meeting. And as we are currently, we are about at 60 gigaton. That's billion of tons. In terms of emissions, and there is no sign of peaking of emissions yet. There are 35 countries in the world that have peaked, but the global overall emissions are still heading upwards. So we are really going towards that 2.8 degree warmer world. And this is where we need to be. We need to reduce those emissions by 2030 down to about 25 gigaton. That's from that 60 gigaton that I just mentioned. And that's where we are in the range where science tells us and the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process, tells us that where we are within that type of emissions that can keep the global average warming towards 1.5 degree. The good news is that it's very possible still to reduce emissions down to that about 25 gigaton of emissions annually by 2030. It would require a high success rate from across all of the sectors: energy, industry, transport, agriculture and waste, buildings, and forest, and the wider nature-based solutions. So without a success rate across all of these, it's not possible to close this gap. So I want to stress that when people stress that their sector is the most important one, it's very true that their sector is important, but we need progress across society. Otherwise, the numbers just don't add up. Okay, UN priorities for 2023. As you can imagine, it's about closing the gap. And especially, we are heavily focused on G20, who account for about 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and also about 85% of the global GDP. So G20 must move for that emissions gap to close. We're also heavily focused on getting text and agreements on the phase out of fossil fuels, and to get progress on the just energy transition. So obviously there's a lot of countries and people that are dependent on the current energy system, and we need to work with them to ensure that the justness principle is smack in the middle for how this energy transition goes. In terms of closing the emissions gap, we can see fairly good progress on transport, on buildings, a little bit less on forests. We see good progress on the energy transition, but it needs to increase still threefold. But we are, as UN, focused on the hard abated sectors. So those sectors where the industrial level progress has not been seen. That's cement, shipping, aviation, and aluminium. Those are our sectors where we need research, we need early investments, and without the help of these sectors, it will be impossible to close the gap. But obviously we need progress across the board. Climate justice is at the heart. We are heavily focused on upgrading the international climate finance architecture. That's both how the multilateral development banks and IFCs work. It's about sticking to the commitment that was done 14 years ago about the $100 billion contribution towards climate action. We have not reached that yet, but we do believe that in this year, 2023, that goal will be reached. The Green Climate Fund is in its second replenishment phase, and that is also a key area of focus for UN to support that countries provide resources towards the GCF. Loss and damage is one of those areas where we did see good progress during COP27, so last year. And there are two items that we're heavily focused on getting on track: the Transitional Committee for the Loss and Damage Fund, and as well as establishing the Secretariat and the function for the Santiago Network, which then provides technical assistance to countries on loss and damage. Adaptation and increasing funding for adaptation to about 50% of all the funding, but there are also other opportunities for raising funding for adaptation, for example, by focusing on climate action that can deliver both adaptation and mitigation outcomes, nature-based solutions being one example. Early warning for all, a key area that can save lives and prevent loss and damage. And the whole of UN is heavily focused on making this happen, that in the next 4 years, all of people across the world would be covered by early warning system. In 2025, the countries are supposed to put forward their climate ambition again. And as you could see from the climate, the emissions gap, that ambition is currently not sufficient to close the emission gap. And by 2025 when countries put forward their next nationally determined contributions and their long-term strategies towards net zero, we need to have a step change in the ambition. There's a number of events happening in the lead up. And in this list, you can see the big ones, which will be critical in building that highest level political support for further climate action, whether that's in those NDCs or whether then it's at COP when we're negotiating text. Quite a number of activities, and you can see partly that these connect to the priorities above as well on finance and so forth. But I want to highlight a couple of them. The two climate summits, one in early September and one in mid-September, that seeks to draw in further commitments and early movers and their commitments that come out, and examples of where large-scale investments happen into climate change. The G20 summit, also in September, is a key one because, as I mentioned, G20 account for such a high part of global emissions. A number of climate weeks that I want to draw your attention to as well. Those also start in September, October, and November, and those are also good opportunities for participating in climate deliberations. Then we look at the COP28 UAE's presidency priorities. Some of these are negotiation items, and I'll also tell on the next slide what will be negotiated in Dubai. But the presidency priorities is on the mitigation work program that heavily connects to those NDCs and net zero targets. So we're very much aligned, you and the COP28 presidency here. The global goal on adaptation is a negotiation item that is coming to end at COP28. So there should be a global goal on adaptation after the COP. The Just Transition Work Program, and then putting in place the Loss and Damage Fund and the Santiago Network. Finance is also a key part for them, and they will not only negotiate and discuss about the $100 billion goal and the financial architecture, but they will also start the discussion about a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And what does that mean? It's then going deeper and further on the $100 billion goal that was set 14 years ago. Two things that I perhaps want to stress to you is that the presidency has been talking about phasing out fossil fuel emissions, whereas UN has been talking about phasing out fossil fuels. There is a notable difference in this, and if needed, I'm happy to go into the nuances of the language. And then the presidency is also putting forward a whole effort on bringing up more innovation into the nature-based side. A little bit more, the main negotiation items are listed here. The first 6 bullet points are those areas where I anticipate fairly tough negotiations that can be dragging out, so to say. And those are definitely the big ticket items. What is that? 7 smaller bullet points are also still being negotiated, but I don't anticipate too much problems around these areas unless they are being held hostage then by one of the bigger ticket items. Excuse me. Okay. Whoops, I think I jumped over this one slide here. So the themes for the presidency by the presidency have not been set yet. This is themes that they are discussing, and very preliminary information on which dates during COP these themes would be discussed. So the 2 first days in December will be the World Climate Action Summit. That means that the heads of states will be present. Then the COP program or theme will go into more topics, so health and humanitarian support. That's a first. The health side has not been highlighted this strongly in previous COPs. Nature, food and water, just energy transition, transport and industry, all of these have been as themes in previous COPs, but as you could see, they are key sectors, and without these, we can't close both the emissions and the adaptation gaps. Youth education skills have been discussed as themes before, but I think they are now getting a stronger focus by UAE in their presidency. Finance, gender, cities, urbanization, and then transport is coming up again. Also things that have been discussed, but because of their importance, there needs to be a continuous focus on them. A few cross-cutting items have been put forward. I don't have information what this will mean yet at the COP, so I don't have no more specific information on it. And then coming to the last slide on discussion. So there's practical issues that are still pending on pavilions. So I'm glad to hear that you have already secured a pavilion, because there is, just yesterday came in an email that the UAE is thinking about merging pavilions and so on. So if you have it secured already, that's great, but be ready for surprises still, because they haven't quite figured it out yet. The venue is amazing. It's where the Expo 2022 was, so I have no concern about venue that it wouldn't be able to deliver. In terms of just accommodation in Dubai, obviously it's one of the key tourism destination and business destinations in the world. So there's plenty of room, but we can already see that room prices are skyrocketing already. So if you know that you're going, try to get in there as soon as possible. A couple of notes on the role of faith groups. So as we are really at the edge of the abyss, also wording that the Secretary General uses, really all hands are needed on deck. So with your voice, reach to communities, and the moral compass that you can bring to it, we do need all strong voices for pushing negotiating parties and then all other stakeholders towards immediate climate action as well. And with that, I would like to thank you and come back to the meeting. Let's see where I am now on my screen somewhere. Stop sharing. Iyad, back to you.
Thank you very much, Niklas. This is very informative, and thank you for touching upon the UN priorities and the presidency. And of course, we don't know what are the priorities of national governments, and this is probably the most important part in the negotiations. They might not be in line with the international priorities and what people want. But that is, of course, to be known during the negotiations when governments start picking on some of these issues according to the national priorities. What I wanted to, before we open the floor to questions, ask you, of course, you mentioned the intersectionality in an indirect way between climate change and other issues, food security, water issues, gender, and so on and so forth. Health for the first time to be discussed there. And this is very important because climate change is not only, the temperature rise, but it is also everything else. So how is that being discussed, and how governments are taking that into the discussions? And the other point, if you could just shed more light on the difference between, phasing out fossil fuel, or the different things that are being discussed. Thank you, and then we'll go back to the questions.
Okay, so if I'll start with those two. So first, there are kind of two, and I don't again know, so sorry if you are seasoned COP participants, so you may know all of this, but there are kind of two parts to a conference of parties. There's the negotiation parts. Once that starts, it's actually really hard to know what's going on because it tends to very quickly go into closed room discussions, informal groups, and so on. So that's really where countries' negotiation teams are sitting together and trying to hash out text and so forth. That all follows the Paris Agreement. So the various articles, whether it's on adaptation or reducing emissions from deforestation or the enhanced transparency framework or so. And then obviously following up also on previous negotiations. But then there's what I call almost the trade fair. So the trade fair is where you then have the 30,000 people that come together and they exchange information on what they're doing on climate action. They're building partnerships. They're doing partnership meeting, project meetings with governments and so on. So the negotiation part is about 1/3 of all the participants at the COP. The rest is the stakeholder discussion, which is super important because it's the biggest trade fair in terms of changing information on what's happening on climate change as well. That's also in that part where you tend to get a lot of the announcements out, whether countries have agreed to green shipping or a offshore wind alliance or these type of things. So that's where, or finance. That's also where you hear that Germany has committed, for example, $2 billion to the Green Climate Fund. Actually, that happened this in Germany just now. But that type of things also happens in the margins of the negotiations. Okay, then coming into the hot potato around the fossil fuel phase out versus fossil fuel emission, phasing out of fossil fuel emissions. This has been an ongoing debate where there are different views amongst the countries on who needs to do what. So a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities. You can frankly drill down most of countries' negotiation points to fairly simple statistics. So if a country has high emissions right now, they tend to in emissions focus on historic emissions, or they tend to focus on per capita emissions. Those that have low per capita emissions, India being an example, they tend to bring that in, that everybody needs to have a budget that country, that a person is allowed. And obviously with those countries that have a lot of population, you can see why they would come to that. So in terms of the fossil fuel phase down of fossil fuel emissions, that has to be, comes to where fossil fuels are consumed. So is it consumed in, or are the emissions in producing countries, or are they released in consuming countries? And frankly, there is no right answer to these things. In fairness, I think it's fair to say that every country, every company, every individual needs to do more than what they think is their fair share. And if we all don't do more than what we think is our fair share, that gap is not closing. So, and it's in every country's interest, every company's interest to do as much as possible, because the future does look quite worrying. Iyad, back to you.
Thank you very much, Niklas. And this is exactly where the faith community and faith actors come to play. We know that faith institutions are the fourth largest economic power on earth, and they do own trillions of dollars in investments, and they do invest sometimes in fossil fuel industries. So this is where the role of faith organizations can be of importance in contributing to reducing the emissions and mitigating the impacts of climate change. Anyway, so I open the floor for friends and colleagues to ask questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand, or if I can see some of you, raise your physical hand. If I see it, I see none at the moment. Don't be shy. Yes, please, Dr. Atiti, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyad, and thank you so much, Niklas. I think this is the most critical discussion happening in regards with all of the COPs that UN bodies has, and we all are focused on how we can contribute meaningfully to COP28. Particularly, there was a mention about tech and innovation with the intersection of climate change, and particularly, I think FFE organizations overall, as such, do face this challenge of keeping abreast with the latest technologies when it comes to climate change action. So how I was at CBD, and I had experienced a few other conventions also, like UNCSW and all. Particularly, this is more like a request and also a question as to how the faith-based organizations can be better engaged in discussions. So, of course, Pavilion is there, and I'm so grateful that we'll have some representation and some discussion within the group, but of faith-based organization with other groups. How does the COP plan this give and take between the two groups? Over to Niklas.
Thank you. Let's take 2 or 3 more questions, and then we go back to Niklas. So Gina is the first on the list. Please go ahead, Gina.
Hi, thank you for that. My name is Gina Castillo, and I work for Catholic Relief Services. I'm based here in Boston. My question is, Niklas, when do you think we'll have a sense of what the priorities of the UAE presidency are going to be, given that this is an important, diplomatic and I guess the role is diplomacy and whatnot? What do you think they're likely to want to push I'm just thinking of the role that Egypt played in the last COP and getting the L&D fund agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Nectar, please go ahead. You're muted. Can you unmute, please?
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Niklas, for a very helpful presentation. I'm Reverend Nick Talubali from the Organization of African Instituted Churches. How does Africa, which has emitted the lowest, position herself in this whole process, especially when we talk about loss and damage, but also in partnership with the other developing countries so that the voice is very clear? For example, when we talk about loss and damage and you talk about vulnerability, Germany can be vulnerable. Anybody can be vulnerable. So the whole issue of vulnerability, the US has been vulnerable. But how do we look at that in relation to the most vulnerable, but also economically vulnerable as nations? Then the second question briefly is, how do we take forward the $100 billion fund, $100 billion fund? Is that what it takes to respond? That is the reality. When the estimates for Africa is like by 2050, it could be over $50 billion and per year. So how are we going to sustain this debate around the 100 billion and who set it up? And how is it calculated? Is it something we need to revisit and we say what is needed exactly? I'll give an example. When you say, okay, African nations decided that 10% of their budget will go to agriculture. 10% in South Africa is different from 10% in Kenya, different from 10% in Burundi. And so how do we continue with this $100 billion fund? Is it exactly what we need? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Nectar. Just one more question before going to Nicholas. Dahlia, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you. This is Dahlia Rockowitz with Dainu, a Jewish Call to Climate Action. And my question, to some extent, is a follow-up on Dr. Mishal's around what, if any, free speech and public demonstration area or availability are we expecting? What are we hearing from the presidency? Mindful that even our hope inside the negotiations is to have a larger role, that oftentimes would be very much appreciated.
We lost you for a minute. I lost you for a minute. So can you please repeat the last sentence?
Sure. I was just saying that our hope is to have access, as much access and input in the negotiations, but sometimes and often we recognize that's limited and we have to take to the public square. So want to know what we expect the conditions to be for public protest, free speech zones, and the ability to have public demonstrations, peaceful, of course.
Thank you very much. So back to you, Nicholas.
Excellent. Thank you, colleagues. Good questions. Okay, so Dr. Mishal and I believe that you then narrowed down on the technology side, the tech innovation. So there is a whole mechanism called the technology mechanism under the convention. That's one of the things that will be negotiated. There is a support program to countries called the CTCN, that's Climate Technology Center and Network. It's actually hosted by UNEP and UNIDO. Its headquarters is in Denmark, Copenhagen. And the CTCN operates through a network of organizations that helps with reviewing and helping understand the latest technology that is out there. And it is indeed such a big issue that countries have decided that there's a whole mechanism for it. I think one good way of being part of it is through these regional networks. And then you have access to information. Countries can request for support from the CTCN in helping them assess what's the most relevant technologies out there, how to decipher the multitude of companies trying to sell technologies, and so on. So technology mechanism follow that in the negotiations. CTCN has available courses, training material, reports, and so on. So I don't recall the URL without looking at it, but CTCN climate technology, and you'll find it. So Gina, on the priorities for UAE, so those was in one of the slides that I mentioned. So it's the negotiation items, and especially the mitigation work program, the global goal on adaptation, the just transition work program. Then it's about operationalizing the loss and damage fund. So the transitional committee is doing its work now and then submits its work to the COP for it to then deliberate further and hopefully approve it. The same with the Santiago network, which is that support mechanism that is being put up. The finance discussion, the new quantified goal on climate finance, those are all priorities of the COP28 presidency. And if you look up, just again, can Bing it or Google it or whichever search engine you use, you can search for COP28 presidency priorities, and there's a number of speeches out there. It always varies a little bit what's in the speech, but roughly those things that I said is what the priorities. And Nikta, about how Africa is positioning itself. So Africa negotiates in two groups. It negotiates as the Africa Group, and there, for example, the Africa Union and the Africa Minister Forum on Environment is helping them with AMSEN, but I couldn't come up with the acronym. What it stands for. They help with negotiating that position. Then they also negotiate as part of the G77 and plus China. And in terms of Africa's role, so as you rightly point out, Africa only accounts for just there between 3 to 4% of global emissions, and very low per capita emissions, and very low emissions when you go into history. So Africa has had very little to do with the pickle we're in now. In terms of the vulnerability, how Africa is still negotiating about it. Africa will organize in September a Africa Climate Action Summit, and it's organized by Kenya and the African Union, and they're stressing in the documentation, so they're stressing that they have not caused this, but they're also stressing that they don't want to be seen just as the victims, but they also want to be part of the transition going forward. They see this as an opportunity of fixing energy access and so forth and so forth. So at least for that Climate Action Summit, they want to see a positive contribution to bringing the world to the next low carbon economy. In terms of vulnerability, yes, there are many other countries and regions in the world that is suffering from the impacts of climate change. For example, the Arctic areas, that's where the heating is happening the quickest. But why then Africa is pinpointed as one of the most vulnerable regions is due to the economy, especially like rain-fed agriculture is a key area, and the capacity and the financial situation to respond to those climatic incidences, whether it's flooding or storms or droughts. I think you had, yes, you mentioned about the $100 billion. It's not a fund. There are multiple funds that are out there. There's the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and so forth and so forth. And the money goes.
Niklas, somebody, you're muted. It seems, yeah.
Does that mean, how long was I muted?
No, just a few seconds.
Okay, so just the $100 billion is not a fund. The $100 billion is a funding target that should come from donor funding, budget support, private sector finance, and so forth. And then Dahlia. Dahlia, you had a question about the access and room for demonstration and free speech. We don't have any further information on it, but the presidency has stressed that free speech is allowed. How that will be arranged, I don't have that information. But a recommendation that I would have for this group is that most countries actually have civil society and stakeholder representation on their country delegations. That's a very good way of getting access to the blue zone, getting access to the latest information from the country delegation. So that would be a good one. And I think somebody asked about that fund. So you have the Green Climate Fund, you have the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, German IKI Fund. There's quite a number of these funds, but those that I listed are some of the biggest one. But obviously also the multilateral development banks are also key. Iyad?
Thank you, Niklas. Just to confirm, the 100 billion target, it's an annual target, right? 100 billion per year, not in total.
No, an annual target of $100 billion. And a lot of the negotiations is about who should pay that. Is it the traditional global north? Is it the emerging economy? Is it private sector? Is it public money? And so forth. So those are why it's never that easy to just somebody coughs up the money and then we got a solution.
Thank you very much. So currently we have 8 friends asking for the floor. So because we are short of time, kindly make your question very brief, and so we can give time to others. So let's start with Michael. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Michael Jemfrey, SIL International. Engagement with indigenous peoples has been getting a higher profile in recent COPs, but I don't see it mentioned in your presentation of this year's COP. Is there a reason for that?
Thank you very much, Michael. Joanna, please go ahead.
Good day all, Joanna Belavita from San Jose, Costa Rica, from Caritas. We would like to know, and I'm also from the Ecclesial Networks Alliance for Integral Ecology, Catholic based. We would like to know how we can have our voices heard, and we also work very much for having the voices from the territories heard. So we would like to know how we can express this, not necessarily with manifestations or taking the floor, but like how can we participate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next online, Grove, sorry, Grove, go ahead.
Good morning, all. Thanks for this session. My question is about the optics of this. Nicholas, you said everyone's going to be called to move beyond what they think is their fair share, but yet this is going to be a luxury resort with exorbitant prices with the powerful gathering. Is there any way to push for some kind of leadership example coming out of the physical manifestation of this COP that would demonstrate the tangible reduction in energy use, reduction in plastics use, the reduction in luxury for the sake of a future for the planet? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you take up these questions, Nicholas, and we continue?
Sure. Michael, no reason why I didn't mention stakeholders more than that. In the presidency priority, they are focused heavily on youth, but there are major stakeholder groups and so forth, actually, of which the faith group is one. So there's no reason why I didn't mention it. I think there is as big of a focus as before. In terms of voices being heard, still I think country delegations, that's a very good entry point. The trade fair part is also a key area, and I would recommend the more you know negotiators, the better placed you are to get insights on what's happening in negotiations, and then also bringing your voices to the negotiators. Grow on the optics, yes, we are bringing together 30,000 or so people to one of the most energy intensive cities in the world and flying there and so on. So each COP has tried with doing their reductions in waste and using renewable energy and so forth. But as of now, the international countries have not agreed to negotiate offline. And we did see during COVID, the 2 years, that some of the negotiations fell behind and they were not able to conclude them. Quite a lot of the negotiation is really people sitting across tables trying to get them states. So there is efforts to it, but we are not at the stage yet where negotiating parties would agree to let's say a lower footprint through online meetings such as this one. Iyad.
Thank you, Nicholas. Then Abdullahi, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Abdullahi. I'm a youth counselor at the Youth Council of the UNEP and the Faith for Earth initiative. My question is, what would be the expectations of the youth from the COP28? Because all the work is on the nature and the future, and this future is for the youth. So
on the youth or of the youth?
Of the youth and on the youth as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Abdullahi. Joel, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay. I want to add to what Margareta has put in the chat. She may ask that later about the Interfaith Liaison Committee involvement in the Pavilion. And I think I'm just interested generally in the pragmatical aspects of how we, as the representatives of different faith communities, my Bishop Julio Murray is with us today, how are we to get involved in the Pavilion? And I just want to understand the logistics of that and how we can set up and what that's going to look like. How do we get involved in the planning of that as faith communities? And then secondly, about the regional climate weeks before COP28. I just want an opinion from you both, from Iyad and from Nicholas, about the value of faith communities participating in those regional climate weeks and how we might be involved. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I will take my part in answering, but let's go to Masomba, please.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Nicholas for the informative presentation. I just want to get a sense of the COP president's involvement in the upcoming conference in Paris. Are they playing a key role, and could we take it that the key outcomes or takeaways from this conference will inform COP28 around the climate finance issue? Thanks.
Thank you, Masomba. And last but not least, my friend Dan, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iyad. I have a tactical question, perhaps, for Nicholas, and I know it's subjective, so bear with me. So in your reading of the discourse at this time, what kinds of messages do you think faith-based communities can offer that would be most resonant? There is sort of the practical dimension of our financial and human resources, the examples being set by communities around the world, the moral and ethical dimension, there are specific advocacy calls. And I know you can say yes and to all of them, but if you were to focus on something and, given your close reading of what's been going on, what do you think is the unique and distinctive value add that we can provide? And thank you so much. I'm Dan Farrell from the Baha'i International Community. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Sorry, there's a new hand that has been raised, Daniel Cassi. Please go ahead, and then we'll go to Nicholas. Daniel? Okay, it seems Daniel is not ready or having problems unmuting. So Nicholas, to you for your answers.
Hello.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Hello, Doctor.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Now, my question and request. The first question is, how can we involve the children, especially in primary school, that's elementary school, who are willing and working so hard to also be part of guarding this world or the common home, which, as the youth said, the future belongs to them. When we miss the environment, we need everyone on board. So I am a teacher, I deal with the children, but we struggle a lot to get invitations to participate in these either regional meetings or global meetings. Then number two, transiting to means that will reduce emissions, means technology, and the sub-Saharan countries, we know the challenges that we are going through. I have tried initiating a program on drone and robotics technology and the AI to involve the children in knowing the technology so that we raise a generation that are engineers who can think of the solutions for this existential threat. But the problem is that it's so difficult to get linked to these organizations that can support such, because those that are existing do not factor in the children within this program, who are the fertile ground that can, if we empower them, then we can be sure that the coming generation will not struggle with the solutions, and especially empowering the teachers in the elementary section. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the very, very, very last question from Martin. Please go ahead, Martin.
Thank you very much. I'm Martin Senyange from the University of Kisubi in Uganda. And I'm interested in knowing the role of higher institutions of learning like University of Kisubi. What are the expectations in this particular regard, particularly when we are dealing with students who are very keen on community engagement in areas of environmental awareness? What type of images, what are the expectations of them, particularly as they are part of the Catholic higher institutions? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know we're behind the hour, so Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, you are really making me work for the money. Again, good questions. So this is, I actually like to be in sessions like this. Abdullahi, expectation of the youth, justice now. The slogan is very relevant from last year. It's about climate finance. That finance needs to flow from those that have the means, those that had more to do with the situation where we are in now. It's about moving from endless negotiations to action, but at the same time getting agreement in those negotiations on some key things, the new climate goal. So our key area that youth, I think all of us actually expect to get results. Expectations on the youth. I do see that the demonstrations, the voices of the youth that we have heard increasingly over the last few years, they do make a difference. That you have the movements on Fridays and demonstrations and so on. Those do go heard. They are discussed in media and so forth. So keeping up the pressure. What I think I would recommend to get more from youth as well, and that connects to Daniel's and Martin's questions as well. There isn't a profession, there isn't a youth that wouldn't have to, in some or the one way or the other, work on climate change in the future. Whether you're going to be a technician, a nurse, a lawyer, all of these things will work on climate change. I don't think there's going to be any shortage of opportunities for youth and those that educate themselves in this field. Joel, that's Iyad for you on the pavilion, but on the regional climate weeks, the regional climate weeks is the opportunity for discussing at a more local level about local experiences. The Africa Climate Week will, for example, be here in Nairobi. Great opportunity even for like UNEP staff to just have the access to all the other practitioners and stakeholders and technology wizards that are out there to just increase your understanding, share your views, and being part of the movement. And yes, I think also grow. There's the optics there as well, that the means of sharing information and so on in these cases are quite often bringing people together. Masomba on the Climate Finance Summit in Paris. I don't know what the role of the COP28 presidency is in it. I believe it's Barbados and France that are bringing it together, but I don't have more details on that. Dan, on what type of messaging. So I think actually you listed a lot of those good things that this community can do. But every country has built up its negotiation position before they go to COP. So it's an ongoing discussion with countries. So it shouldn't be like a peak. It should be about bringing that in all your operations to talk about the imperative of addressing climate change as a human right, as a morally right thing. And at the same time, we will need a full shift in the economy. So while we're breaking records on investments in renewable every year, we also keep on breaking records in investment into fossil fuels. So as owners of assets, don't be part of the negative impacts out there. Daniel on how to involve children and so on. So I think one of the, because we are looking at a system-wide transition and we will need every hand on deck and all professions for it. Really, curricula is at a centerpiece. We have to shift curricula not only to decarbonize, build resilience and so on, but also take up on the opportunities of building resilience and decarbonizing brings. And that's why I'm particularly pleased on how Kenya and African Union is phrasing their Africa Climate Action Summit, that we see this as an opportunity. And frankly, the country where I come from, I'm from Finland, it's the green transition that brings investments. It's not the investments anymore into coal or so. So there's a lot of opportunities here, and that drive, that excitement that could come from it, I believe is a strong force. I don't know if your ages, but if you remember the IT in the early 90s, everybody wanted to invest. Obviously, there was a bubble, but just as an excitement of how much can happen in quite a short time. Martin, and this also then the answer connects to Daniel's question on how to involve children. Higher education will be a centerpiece in the long-term transition and the system change that is needed. Next generation of technicians, of teachers, of all of these need to have a much better understanding of climate. And I want to add also, not just climate, but how we live in harmony with nature, how we come up with solutions that do not pollute, and so on. So actually within UNEP, I'm trying to push for a much higher focus on the education part, and that we're taking a systemic approach to building capacity and not just doing workshops or so, but next generation of professionals will have to be able to deliver. Iyad, back to you.
Thank you very much, Niklas. I know it's a very hard time, or a tough time to be able to answer each and every question and in details, because this would require hours. So let me just take my part. Well, Joel, I will reinvigorate, re-establish our communications with you and with Wilton Park. This is in the making. However, we have been in contact with Martha from the Archbishop's office, but we will be happy to have you as part of the coordination team. And as Niklas mentioned, everything happens before COP28. Countries come almost determined with what they want to achieve from COP28 before COP28. And this is why we have established this coordination mechanism before COP28. We call it the pre-COP preparation of faith leaders. And, every negotiator, or not every, according to research, 85% of people believe in a religion and they go to a church or a mosque or a synagogue. So what we're hoping is that for faith leaders, those who are engaged in the process of climate change, and to grab the opportunity of, the negotiators, the politicians, when they go to pray to God, to grab that opportunity and talk to them about their, commitments, not only to God, but also to the people that they serve. So this meetings that we are organizing and this period before COP28 is a golden opportunity for faith leaders to use their power of reaching out to the negotiators and the politicians when they come to prayers, or even when they have the privilege of connecting with politicians. So please, If you know negotiators, politicians who are engaged in climate change, talk to them now. Don't wait until COP28 and make a speech. We want now to sit with them and convince them of the priorities of the people rather than the priorities of the UN or the presidency. So this is from my part. Again, thanks everybody. We had almost 90 persons today participating. As I mentioned, we have a monthly process going on. We would like to see all of you again. But if you have something to offer before or during COP, please come to me or to one of my team members, and we will include you in the preparation process so we can get the most out of our collaboration together. So thank you, Niklas. Thank you again. And thank you, everybody, and God bless you all. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye.
Iyad. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Thank you, Lord. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.